Welcome to our deep dive. And today we're tackling a pretty complex topic,
Mm.
mass deportations in the United States.
It's definitely a hot button issue.
Yeah, it is, for sure. And we've got a whole bunch of articles here to try and unpack it all.
Articles covering everything from the economics all the way to like international relations.
Seriously, the whole spectrum. But, what we really want to try to do is, look past the rhetoric and all the sound bites,
Yeah, get to the heart of what this kind of policy would actually look like and what it would mean.
Exactly. Like, what are the real-world consequences?
Right, because there's a lot of assumptions out there.
Oh, tons. Like the idea that mass deportations would save the country money or even strengthen the economy.
But when you dig into the research, it gets a lot more complicated.
Way more. In fact, one of the articles here is from the American Immigration Council, and they estimate that deporting 1 million people, like every year, over a decade,
Huge numbers.
it could cost almost $1 trillion. $1 trillion. That's like mind-boggling.
It really puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
Totally. Because, okay, think about it. $1 trillion? That's enough to build over 40,000 elementary schools.
That's incredible. Imagine what else that kind of money could be used for.
Seriously. Healthcare, infrastructure, all kinds of things that benefit, like, everyone.
Instead, it's potentially going towards a policy with a giant price tag and, well, very uncertain results.
Exactly. And that's just the direct cost we're talking about here, right?
Right. The tip of the iceberg. We've got articles from the Peterson Institute and the Brookings Institution, too, and they dive into the potential consequences for the economy as a whole.
Yeah, like ripple effects. It's not just about the money spent on the deportations themselves.
Exactly. And what's crazy is that some of what they found actually contradicts the arguments people use to support these deportations.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the most interesting things, I think. Like how the data doesn't always match up with the rhetoric.
Right. Like, you often hear people say that mass deportations would boost the economy, but these studies suggest that they could actually hurt it. They estimate that the GDP could shrink by as much as 1.2 to 7.4% by 2028.
Okay, hold on. Just for folks who maybe don't spend all day thinking about economics,
Yeah.
GDP, that's like the total value of everything produced in a country, right?
Exactly. So a shrinking GDP basically means the economy is producing less, which can lead to job losses, wages, just generally a lower standard of living for everyone.
Okay, wow. So that's a huge deal.
Definitely.
But why would deporting people actually make the GDP go down? Wouldn't it, I don't know, free up jobs and resources for American citizens?
It seems logical, right? But it kind of overlooks the fact that undocumented immigrants are already part of the economy.
Yeah, they're working, they're paying taxes, they're buying stuff.
Exactly. They contribute to consumer spending. They fill jobs in a lot of different sectors.
Right.
When you remove them from the picture, you're basically creating labor shortages, disrupting businesses, reducing overall economic activity.
So it's more like taking out a vital part of a complex machine. You're not just making it run better, you're probably messing it up.
Exactly. It's way more complicated than just assuming everyone who's undocumented is taking something away.
Right, right. So that whole idea that mass deportations would, automatically boost the economy, that's actually probably wrong. It could end up hurting everyone, not just the people being deported.
Exactly. And I think it highlights why it's so crucial to, look at the data, the actual research, rather than just going with assumptions or what sounds good.
Absolutely. Don't believe the hype.
Right.
But, okay, so we've talked about the money, the potential economic fallout, but it's not just about the dollars and cents here, right? Our sources also get into, the legal and humanitarian sides of these
The
policies.
human cost, yeah.
Right. And one thing that really struck me is how these policies can actually impact legal immigration, too.
Yeah, that's something people don't always think about.
Right. It's not just about who's here without documentation.
One example that really stands out is the whole thing with the CBP-1 app. They deactivated it, and it's created these huge backlogs and delays for people trying to come here legally.
Oh, yeah, the CBP-1 app. What exactly is that again? Just to, refresh everyone's memory.
Sure. It's basically an app from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and it was designed to, streamline the legal entry process. People could schedule appointments, submit applications, especially those seeking asylum or refugee status.
Okay, right.
But now that it's deactivated, the process has gotten way more difficult, particularly for vulnerable populations. It's a real mess.
So we're talking about people who are following the rules, trying to do things the right way, and they're getting caught up in this, too.
Absolutely. It's affecting Afghan refugees who were promised safety in the U.S., after helping our troops, and families that have been waiting for years to legally reunite. These are people who did everything right, and now they're facing incredible hardship because of these policy changes.
Man, that's rough. And it kind of raises some serious questions, about fairness, due process.
Definitely. I mean, everybody deserves to have their case heard, their rights respected, no matter their immigration status. That's a fundamental principle.
Totally agree. And that's why this whole legal and humanitarian angle is so crucial. We can't just be focused on the numbers, the economics. Got to remember the human impact, too.
Absolutely. We're
Yeah.
talking about real people's lives, their futures. It's about more than just policies and statistics.
Right, exactly. And speaking of the human cost, our sources also brought up some concerns about uh, potential discrimination in how these policies are enforced.
Yeah, the idea that certain groups are being targeted.
Yeah, like racial profiling or focusing on some immigrant groups over others.
Exactly. There's a real concern that enforcement isn't being applied equally, that it's biased against certain ethnicities or nationalities.
And we're not even just talking about who gets targeted, but also how it all goes down. Some of this stuff in these articles is pretty concerning, to be honest.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about the use of military resources and tactics in deportation efforts, which raises some big questions.
Like, is that even appropriate? Using military force for immigration issues?
Right. It raises concerns about excessive force and whether we're blurring the lines between immigration enforcement and military action.
And then there are those incidents of U.S. citizens being detained because they couldn't immediately prove their citizenship. That's messed up.
It definitely highlights the potential for errors, and the possibility of overreach when you have these large-scale enforcement operations going on.
It kind of starts to feel like maybe this is less about actually enforcing the law and more about making some kind of statement.
Yeah, like a show of force.
Exactly. It's like we're taking this blunt instrument to a really complex problem.
And that's always a dangerous approach, isn't it? Oversimplifying complex issues usually creates more problems than it solves.
Ugh, I know. It's definitely making me think twice about this whole mass deportation thing. I mean, we've talked about the potential economic mess, the legal and humanitarian worries, and now these issues of like discrimination and fairness. It's a lot.
It is a lot to unpack, and we've only just scratched the surface. It's a multifaceted issue with far-reaching implications, that's for sure.
And we're not even done. We still haven't talked about the impact on our relationships with other countries, or even just the logistics of how you'd actually carry out mass deportations on this scale.
Yeah, those are both huge parts of the conversation, and they raise even more questions about whether this policy is actually feasible or even wise.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep digging into this. It's been eye-opening so far.
Me too. There's a lot more to explore here.
It's easy to get kind of focused on the domestic side of all this, but, our sources also highlight how these policies could impact our relationships with other countries.
Especially in Latin America.
Right. Like, this stuff doesn't just stay within our borders.
Exactly. It's a global issue. These policies have ripple effects throughout the region, and there's a huge potential for unintended consequences.
Yeah, like one article mentioned how Colombia initially resisted U.S. deportation flights,
But they push back, yeah.
but then ultimately gave in because of economic pressure.
It puts those countries in a tough spot.
It really does.
They're forced to choose between, their own values and principles and maintaining a good relationship with the U.S., which often comes with economic benefits, right?
Right.
It's a balancing act that can lead to resentment and instability.
Totally. And what happens when those countries actually start pushing back harder against U.S. pressure? I mean, we can't exactly force them to accept deportees.
No, you can't. And that's where things could get really messy. If countries start refusing to cooperate with U.S. deportation efforts, it creates this logistical nightmare, not to mention the diplomatic fallout.
Yeah, it could really damage our relationships in the region.
Absolutely. And we're already seeing signs of that. There's an article here that talks about how some Latin American countries are strengthening ties with China and Russia.
Oh, wow.
It's a way to counter U.S. influence,
Yeah, playing the field.
Exactly. And it's a classic geopolitical power play. If we alienate our allies through these policies, we risk pushing them towards our rivals.
And that's definitely not good for U.S. interests.
Not at all. The stakes are high.
Okay, so let's set aside the international stuff for a second and talk about whether mass deportations are even logistically possible. I mean, how do you actually remove millions of people from a country?
That's the million-dollar question.
It seems impossible.
It would be an enormous undertaking, requiring a level of resources and coordination we've never seen before.
I can't even imagine where you'd begin with something like that.
Well, you'd need a massive increase in personnel.
Like more Border Patrol.
Border Patrol, immigration officers, detention center staff. The whole system would need to expand dramatically.
And that's just people. What about the actual physical space? Where do you put all these people?
You'd have to build new detention centers, expand existing ones, and make sure they're equipped to handle a massive influx of people. And that's not even considering the legal process. Everyone has the right to due process, which means providing lawyers, judges, courtrooms for potentially millions of cases.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is. And all that comes at a cost. We're already talking about $1 trillion in direct costs, but the logistical expenses would be astronomical.
Yeah, it's got to be billions, maybe even trillions more.
Easily. It's a massive drain on resources that could be used for other priorities, like education, healthcare, infrastructure.
And even if we could somehow overcome all of that, the logistics, the money, there's still no guarantee that it would actually be effective.
Right.
Have we ever even tried anything like this before?
There have been large-scale deportation efforts in the past, but nothing on the scale being proposed now. And even those smaller efforts were full of challenges and controversies.
What kind of challenges?
They often led to family separations, wrongful detentions, and a climate of fear and uncertainty in immigrant communities.
So it's not just a logistical nightmare, it's a humanitarian one, too.
It is. We're talking about a policy with very few upsides and a whole lot of potential downsides.
Yeah, this deep dive has really been making me question the whole idea of mass deportations. What seemed like a simple solution is looking more and more like a Pandora's box of problems.
It's definitely a policy that requires a lot more thought and consideration. We need to move past the sound bites and emotional appeals and look at the facts.
Absolutely. I mean, we've thrown a lot of information at you today, listener, but hopefully it's given you a more nuanced understanding of the potential consequences of mass deportations.
Because this isn't a simple issue, it's complex, and there are no easy answers.
It really isn't.
But understanding the complexities is the first step towards having a meaningful conversation about how we, as a society, want to approach the challenges of immigration.
You know, going through all this research, it really strikes me how easy it is to get caught up in, like, all the numbers and the policy stuff.
A big picture.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, we can't forget we're talking about real people's lives.
Absolutely. It's easy to lose sight of the human cost when you're dealing with abstract concepts, like border security or economic impact.
Right, those big ideas.
But behind every statistic, there's a story.
A person.
A family.
A dream.
Yeah, exactly.
And these articles really bring those stories to life. Like, we're reading about families being torn apart, children separated from their parents, people living in constant fear of being detained or deported.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
And it's not just about the direct impact on, those who are undocumented.
Right.
Think about the ripple effects on families, communities, even entire industries.
Yeah, one article talked about how these policies could affect agriculture.
Oh, right.
Like, a lot of farms rely heavily on undocumented labor, and mass deportations could really mess with their workforce.
They're creating shortages.
Huge shortages, and that could lead to, like, higher food prices, even shortages for consumers.
Wow. It's a perfect example of how these policies can have these unintended consequences that go way beyond the intended targets.
Totally. It's like everything's connected, right?
Yeah.
One policy decision can have this huge ripple effect across, like, so many different parts of society.
It's a chain reaction.
It is. And that's why, it's so important to approach this whole issue with nuance.
And empathy.
Yes.
Yes.
Empathy. We can't just boil it down to a simple equation or a black and white issue. It's so much more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And that complexity gets lost in the political back and forth,
Lost in the noise.
Yeah, exactly. It's easier to, demonize the other than to actually have a real conversation about the challenges of immigration.
Ugh, it's so true. This deep dive has really made me think about what it actually means to be well-informed on this issue. It's not just about knowing the facts and figures.
Right.
It's about understanding the human stories behind those numbers and being able to see things from multiple perspectives.
It's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Exactly. Being well-informed means going beyond the headlines, beyond the sound bites, and really grappling with how complex it all is.
It means digging deeper.
Yes. And being willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Right. And to engage with viewpoints that might be different from your own.
Because that's where real understanding comes from.
Right.
Being open to different perspectives and being willing to have those tough conversations.
That's how we grow and learn.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to encourage you, listener, to keep exploring these sources, keep asking questions, and keep thinking critically about this whole issue of mass deportations.
Yeah, keep the conversation going.
Because at the end of the day, finding solutions to the challenges of immigration is going to require an informed and engaged public.
People who are willing to move past the rhetoric.
And work towards common ground.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, listener.
We'll see you next time.